Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Brian Wilson, and I'm a faculty member in the School of Kinesiology, director of UBC's Centre for Sport and Sustainability, and a sociologist. And I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to welcome you to today's seminar series talk, jointly hosted by the School of Kinesiology and the Centre for Sport and Sustainability, featuring Dr. Jason Laurendeau of the University of Lethbridge. I'll begin the seminar by acknowledging that we're gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Now, this acknowledgement is, of course, always pertinent to events held on this territory, and I'll say that thinking about this acknowledgement in relation to physical culture and sport and the land and water and air of this territory is something that's especially important when introducing many of the kinds of events associated with kinesiology, and the Center for Sport and Sustainability. I highlight this now especially as a segue to what will be coming up next in the seminar, as I'm aware that Dr. Moss Norman will be elaborating on this point as part of his introduction of Dr. Jay Laurendeau. And I'd be not surprised if Jay spoke a little bit in some way to lend acknowledgements as well. Recognizing you're here to see our speaker and not me, I'll aim to be succinct with this and begin with just a couple of comments about the Center for Sport and Sustainability, how it is linked to the seminar we're co-hosting today, follow this with some thank yous to those who made this possible, and finally introduce Moss Norman, who has the privilege of being able to introduce Dr. Laurendeau. So just to begin, for those who are unfamiliar with the Center for Sport and Sustainability, it is a research and knowledge mobilization center based in the School of Kinesiology and the Faculty of Education, with a mandate to, among other things, explore relationships between sport and sustainability with particular attention, and this is key, to what sustainability has to do with social and environmental justice, recognizing that the term sustainability has been and can be associated with a range of activities that both align with justice-related aims and sometimes not. So with this in mind, explorations of justice-related topics in the realm of sport and physical culture, especially those related to different forms of pedagogy, how the meanings of things that we've come to take for granted and how they can sometimes be rethought and challenged, and should be rethought and re-challenged, and maybe unsettled, to use from the title of the talk, and how these are commonly featured. So in this note, I will highlight here that this talk is being recorded and will be featured on the CSS's Media and Education website called the Sport and Sustainability Media and Education Resource, where you can find a range of materials that engage with sport and sustainability related topics. So we'll now offer a few thank yous to those who've supported this event and Dr. Laurendeau's visit. So first to Dr. Jean-Sébastien Blouin. Jean has been a champion for the School of Kinesiology Speaker Series for a while now. I just like to express gratitude for all you do in organizing these, and also your openness to this collaboration between the school and the Center for Sport and Sustainability for doing this. So thanks so much, Jean. I'd also like to acknowledge some funders that have helped support this event and the activities around it. I'd first like to acknowledge the Grants for Catalyzing Research Clusters Fund, supported through the offices of UBC's Vice President, Research and Innovation, and the Provost and Vice President, Academic. So that funding not only supported the activities intended to catalyze collaborations around the Center for Sport and Sustainability, like the one that Dr. Laurendeau's visit is a part of, but it's also funded the development of the Media and Education Resource I mentioned earlier. Now, relatedly, I will acknowledge UBC's Edith Landau Virtual Learning Center that is funding the creation of a video on settler colonialism and physical culture that'll be featured on the Media and Education Resource. And it's a video that Moss and Jason and Dr. Janice Forsyth, also of the School of Kinesiology, are collaborating on. And I believe that's one of the reasons Jay's here, is to work on that. Finally, and I don't know if he is here or online, but I would like to acknowledge Dr. Robert Burchell. Robert is former director of the School of Kinesiology, having just finished his second and final term as director. He was a champion of activities for the CSS during his entire term as director, attending and actively participating in events like this. He often did what I'm doing right now as a way of introducing what's happening. His knowledge and assertion that the School of Kinesiology has a crucial role to play in addressing existential crises related to climate change and related social and environmental justice issues has been a real inspiration for those of us working with the CSS and is quite frankly a reason that the Center for Sport and Sustainability still exists. So Rob, if you're online or out there, thanks so much for what you've done. My final activity now is to introduce Moss, who has been integral to obviously to organizing this event and bringing Jay out to spend some time with us. So Moss has been a key contributor to Center for Sport and Sustainability activities over the years. He organized not that long ago an event with Dr. Forsyth, a panel event called Pushed Out of This League, Anti-Indigenous Structural Racism in Canadian Hockey. Previous to that, Moss organized and moderated an event entitled What is the Truth About Sport and Reconciliation? Community-Centered Sport, Decolonization and Indigenous Resurgence that featured leaders of the BC-based Indigenous Youth Mountain Bike Program. Moss himself is well known for contributions to outstanding and highly collaborative research that examines the intersections of settler colonialism, Indigenous masculinities, and physical culture, including a Moss-led paper that won the Outstanding Article Award with the Sociology Sport Journal not that long ago. The last thing I'll highlight with attention to the pedagogy theme of the talk today is a chapter that Moss and Janice Forsyth, who I mentioned, co-wrote for a recently released Sociology of Sport textbook for Canadian undergraduate students in kinesiology and related fields. This exemplary chapter, entitled Indigeneity, Sport, and Physical Culture, is a new chapter in a multi-edition book, and it will, I think, be a game changer for instructors across Canada who teach sociology of sport and physical culture classes, who will undoubtedly be relying on this chapter, supporting their teaching on settler colonialism and indigeneity for years to come. And while it's a great teaching resource, I'd recommend it for anybody who can. And I know that Moss will be highlighting Jason's outstanding work in this realm as well, which actually includes another outstanding chapter in the same book with some similar themes, and I can't wait to hear it. But I'll end here with a big thank you to Moss for organizing this event, and I'll pass it over to you. So who will introduce Jason now?
Thank you. So thank you. As Brian mentioned, my job here is to introduce a friend and a phenomenal scholar, Dr. Jason Laurendeau, who's going to talk about pedagogy, colonialism, and indigeneity in kinesiology. Now, these themes align with many of the things that we've been thinking about and working on in the school for a number of years now. So in some ways, introducing Jay's talk should be fairly straightforward. Having said that, Jay comes here in circumstances that are anything but straightforward. And without being too dramatic, I think circumstances have become infinitely more complex, dare I say dangerous, in the last few months. So by way of introducing Jay, I want to take a few minutes to talk about the broader social context in which he's giving this talk. Before doing so, I do want to reflect on the land acknowledgement. You know, at the University of British Columbia and university campuses across this country, it has become common practice to open meetings and events by acknowledging the land. And this is a really important shift that's happened over the last number of years. But to say that land acknowledgements are common practice is not to say that they're banal, or at least that's not the intention behind them. Rather, land acknowledgements at their very best should provoke deeper considerations of what it is we're witnessing when we acknowledge land, and what responsibilities such witnessing invites us to take up in our research, in our service, and of course in our teaching, which is what Jay's going to speak to us about today. But as I mentioned, teaching has become more complex, dangerous even in the present moment. Indeed, we're living in a context where institutions of higher learning are under attack. As someone who primarily draws on critical theories in my teaching and research, I'm actually accustomed to Marxist theories and critical Indigenous studies and feminist and queer theories being attacked and derided. But we're in a different moment here, because now the biosciences are under attack as well. And so many scholars are referring to this as the post-truth era. So what does it mean to teach when knowledge and truth are increasingly untethered from the rigorous methodological processes that have characterized not just Western sciences and social sciences, but culturally diverse ways of coming to know more broadly? How do we respond to these crises of truth that confront higher education? Well, the short answer, somewhat predictably, is education. But what does education look like in this context? How do we educate in a manner that responds to these crises without being determined by them? And Dr. Jason Laurendeau, or Jay, is here to help us think more deeply about our teaching, particularly as we grapple with questions of decolonization and indigenization in the classroom. Jay is a professor in the sociology department at the University of Lethbridge, and he is also the current president of the North American Society for the Sociology of Sport, or NAS. His research interests include the intersections of embodiment, gender, risk, and physical culture. More recently, Jay has taken up questions of sport and recreation as spaces of both colonial violence and Indigenous resurgence. One of his recent books, entitled Sport, Physical Activity, and Anti-Colonial Autoethnography, is an exceptional book. It's exceptional. And it's quickly found itself on the must-read list of most graduate students and scholars in the sociology of sport. And if you haven't checked out this book, I'd look at it not just for the substantive content, but also the methodological considerations as well. It's excellent. Jay is also a master educator, having been recognized by the University of Lethbridge for his teaching, and he runs teaching seminars in the very subject he's going to speak to us about today. But he's also a fearless educator. And it seems to me in these dangerous times, we need what Bell Hooks calls pedagogies of courage. Pedagogies that include bringing complex and contentious topics and issues into the classroom in a manner that fosters the type of dialogue, community, and relationship building necessary to respond to the moment in which we're living. And I'm going to now turn it over to Jay to help us through some of these considerations. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Laurendeau.
Hello to everyone here in person, to those joining us via Zoom, and thanks for the introduction, Moss. I'm going to have a little trouble responding to it, but I think you've set up where we're going beautifully. My thanks as well for all of the behind-the-scenes work that you and others have been doing to make today's talk and my visit more broadly possible. To Brian and others who make the seminar series happen, I know well all the work that goes on behind the scenes to make some of these things come to be. And not least to those who have joined us, again, both in person and online at this busy time of the year and semester. Oh, right, I've got one of these fancy clickers somewhere. And true to form, no idea where it is. Here we go. I appreciate the territorial acknowledgement, and I'm conscious of my own responsibilities as an uninvited guest on these lands. I also have enduring responsibilities stemming from the fact that I'm undertaking much of the work represented in this talk while living and working in Sikokotok, lands claimed by the city of Lethbridge, the province of Alberta, and the still settling state of Canada. Sikokotok is part of the territory of the Siksikaitsitapi, or Blackfoot-speaking people, territory which extends from the North Saskatchewan River to the Yellowstone River, north to south, and the Rocky Mountains to the confluence of the North and South Saskatchewan Rivers, west to east. Blackfoot peoples have cared for these lands since time immemorial, and many other Indigenous peoples have and continue to call these lands home and take up their responsibilities in relation to these territories. These same lands and waters, broadly speaking, have nourished me personally and professionally for the vast majority of my life. And picking up on what both Brian and Moss just offered, acknowledging the lands themselves is important. By itself, though, this does little or nothing to highlight what those of us who are settlers on these lands are doing about that, about our occupation of these territories. We settlers, in other words, need to do more than simply acknowledge our presence on these lands. We need, in Lixon scholar Rachel Flowers' terms, to think through the term settler as a set of responsibilities and action. Anishinaabe scholar Tricia McGuire-Adams builds on Flowers' work, arguing to call oneself a settler is not about signifying if one is non-Indigenous. Rather, it ignites responsibilities that call attention to the decentering of whiteness, the disruption of privilege, and the enactment of anti-racist relationships with Indigenous peoples, communities, and territories. A key part of my set of responsibilities is to do my own work, interrogating my own practices and assumptions. Vitally, I want to be clear and explicit that I do not undertake the work that you'll hear about today from any position of mastery. I interrogate the narratives of kinesiology faculty members not because I know the right thing to do, quote unquote, which is a point I return to in the analysis, but as part of my own process of learning and unlearning. It's important at the outset to briefly situate myself for listeners. I think and write from my positioning as a cisgender, heterosexual, non-disabled white settler. And before I started trimming this back, given time constraints, I had a lot more to say about that, but I'm just going to leave it there for the moment. Before I turn to the heart of my comments today, I want to express my deep gratitude to a collaborator who's not in the room. I've undertaken much of the work I'll share today with a former student and now co-conspirator, Numa Surmawala. Numa was at the University of Lethbridge and now is at the University of Victoria, the kind of student who challenges both classmates and instructors to bring their most thoughtful and expansive selves to the classroom space. It has been a pleasure to learn from and with Numa as we've waded into this project together. On lands claimed by Canada, in the wake of the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or TRC, many post-secondary institutions have committed themselves to projects they sometimes name as indigenization, decolonization, and/or reconciliation. On screen, images from the University of Lethbridge Strategic Plan with a drawn representation of a teepee and the UBC Indigenous Strategic Plan. This kind of initiative is evident, for example, at the University of Lethbridge, or U of L, where I've been employed since 2006. Consider, for instance, the U of L's recently launched strategic plan, one in which, quote, everyone is invited into our teepee, end quote. The strategic plan articulates commitments to, quote, weaving Indigenous knowledges and cultures into all we do, end quote, and to integrating Indigenous perspectives into curricula, research, and services, as you see on screen here. I note that the 2020 UBC Indigenous Strategic Plan, which I will say is much better fleshed out and actually has deliverables in contrast to most of what I've seen coming out of the U of L, articulates a goal of, quote, indigenizing our curriculum to include Indigenous ways of knowing, culture, histories, experiences, and worldviews in curriculum delivered across faculty, programs, and campuses. In this context, it's imperative that we inquire into how such aspirations are operationalized, what institutions are actually doing on the ground. This, of course, takes many shapes, including student services, on-campus programming, recruitment, retention, research support, and more. The focus of the work that I present today specifically is on the kind of claim that the U of L offers, that we integrate Indigenous perspectives into curricula. Drawing on interviews with faculty members in kinesiology departments at 3 different institutions, I reflect today on numerous layers, challenges, and tensions as academics share, when they consider whether and how they engage with Indigenous authors, materials, and/or ways of knowing in their teaching. Whether and how, in other words, they integrate Indigenous perspectives in the classroom. Before turning to my analysis, I offer an introduction to settler colonialism and to the entanglements of academia with the ongoing settler colonial project, as well as a historicization and an interrogation of kinesiology as both an interdisciplinary space and a political project in its own right. We can think of settler colonialism as a structuring structure, one that, to adapt Beardall's words, creates a foundation of violence, white supremacy, racism, racial capitalism, ableism, and cis-heteropatriarchy, upon which settler states construct all dominant social institutions. In other words, the governing logic in what Cherokee Nation scholar Daniel Heath Justice calls a new social order imposed in colonial contexts is inescapably a colonial logic. The dominant institutions of the settler state, such as government, child welfare, and criminal justice, for example, are structured, that is, according to the logics of the ongoing and genocidal project of settler colonialism. This also applies to the institution of higher education. As Sandy Grande puts it, the academy is an arm of the settler state, a site where the logics of elimination, capital accumulation, and dispossession are reconstituted. I return to this point momentarily. Settler colonialism functions as a project of erasure, rendering invisible not only the complexities of Indigenous peoples, histories, lives, communities, and physical cultural practices, but also the operation of settler colonialism itself. As Cook puts it, insofar as settler colonialism aims for complete settlement, it demands both the elimination of Indigenous peoples and the ignorance of its own operations. Settler colonialism aims to make itself invisible. Numerous scholars have interrogated the whiteness and colonial underpinnings of higher education in general, and on Turtle Island in particular. In the North American context, it's important to understand that universities were founded in part to Christianize Indigenous youth and ensure settler futurity through teaching, to borrow from Hampton, Protestantism, the English language, and British culture to the white settler youth of the growing colony. Hampton expands on this idea, noting that by the early 20th century, in addition to promoting European classical knowledge, the university served as a site for the development of racial ideology that served to justify slavery and colonization without contradicting European Enlightenment ideas about freedom and equality. Indeed, the university, Daigle expounds, is a crucial site of settler colonial relations, as well as an intrinsic part of the settler colonial state. The logics, that is, that shape that shape and reproduce the university and are shaped and reproduced by the university are necessarily and inextricably tied to those logics foundational to the reproduction of settler colonialism itself, especially imperatives of neoliberal global racial capitalism. And as Moss was suggesting, I think that's never been more true than at this moment. There are, of course, moves afoot ostensibly organized around reimagining the university to respond to the kinds of critiques outlined above. As noted at the outset of my comments, many of these are tethered implicitly or explicitly to the idea of indigenization, representing, in Gaudry and Lorenz's terms, a move to expand the Academy's still narrow conceptions of knowledge to include Indigenous perspectives in transformative ways. Where things start to get rather murky, however, is in the how, the particular shape that this process might take. Too often, indigenization is operationalized by academic institutions as a particular version of inclusion, ostensibly achieved by hiring more Indigenous scholars and staff and recruiting more Indigenous students. The process of indigenization via inclusion, however, leaves uninterrogated and untroubled the dominant understandings of knowledge and knowledge production that instantiate much colonial violence, as Gaudry and Lorenz explain, writing, "When indigenization is understood as a means to include Indigenous peoples better in the Academy, it also tends to assume that the Academy is a natural, or at least neutral, place in which human knowledge is already adequately represented." Which brings us to kinesiology. Kines, as a discipline of study, is important to critically interrogate, not least because of its historical roots. In the North American context, both physical education at the primary and secondary levels and physical education or kinesiology as an area of academic study arose out of eugenic concerns with the so-called stock of the nation. Writing from a US context, for instance, Couturier explains that the major tenets of eugenics, the perfectibility of man, race purity, birth rates, the white standard, and the inferiority of other groups can all be found in the physical education literature. Peers and Tink elaborate on the sense in which scientific racism, and thus the work of physical education as an emerging discipline, was tied to the fitness of the settler nation. In their words, it was argued by many educators, doctors, figure out whether I've got the slides lined up at a certain point. There we go, yep. And politicians, that the physical fitness and mental fitness of the population were deeply linked to each other and to the racial fitness of the population as a whole, which had to be defended at all costs. Fitness here referred to the degree to which one's body, capacities, desires, and heritage fit within the white supremacist notions of superior European evolution. Importantly, as suggested above, the fitness of the nation was rooted not only in notions of physical and mental fitness, but in racialized and colonial notions thereof. In an interrogation of physical education in residential schools, for instance, Janice Forsyth, who you all know well, I'm sure, expounds as follows. Couched in terms of self-improvement, Native students were subjected to regimented physical training programs designed to inculcate patriotic values and instruct male and female students in appropriate masculine and feminine behaviors. Regimented training programs were thought to provide Native youth with much-needed lessons in life. This discourse revolved around notions of racial uplift. Successful curricula would not only help Native students to rise above, quote unquote, their race and assume positions in the labor force, they might entice them to give up their Native status as well. While it might be tempting to read these accounts as relics of a bygone past, such an approach would align with the myth-making associated with both the discipline of kinesiology, as Smith and Jameson outline, and with settler states like Canada. Smith and Jameson articulate this as follows. The discipline's obsession with an uncritical value for, scientific data placed physical education, and by extension sport, on a path that both established and reinforced racial codes and practices. Over the course of more than a century, as the discipline has developed and evolved into various subdisciplines, each is challenged by the ways the past continues to influence their present understandings of race and ethnicity and their relationships to the practice and study of human movement. In recent years, a number of scholars have considered contemporary kinesiology programs in Canada, highlighting how the discipline continues to be an important site for the reproduction of whiteness and white supremacy. Nachman, Joseph, and Fusco consider faculty representations and activities in kinesiology programs and student perspectives thereon, as well as the relative absence of questions of racialization and racial injustice in such programs. They offer a scathing indictment of kinesiology's failures to decenter or even acknowledge whiteness in structures and practices. Writing, whiteness is manifested in Canadian kinesiology programs through white privilege in faculty demographics, overlooking whiteness in research and teaching, and white dominance in student culture, where white cultures are central but unnamed. The work of Sullivan and Ali, as well as that of Barnes, Nakamura, and Safai, relies on publicly available documents and materials to interrogate the cultural space and political work of kinesiology programs on lands claimed by Canada. Barnes and colleagues consider the mission and vision statements, or lack thereof, of almost 40 such departments, noting that the preponderance of such statements, quote, adopt the tactics of depoliticization by extracting academic programs, rationales, and impacts from their historical emergence and social context. They go on to argue that, quote, the elision of culture and history in mission and vision statements permit kinesiology to present as an apolitical and culturalist project, while at the same time producing ideas about society, social change, and citizenship that benefit the interests of corporate universities. These authors pose the provocative and important question, how is it possible to imagine that students who are not well versed in power, colonialism, and racism are adequately ready to serve as health and physical activity leaders in a settler colonial multicultural Canada? Barnes and colleagues argue that corporatized views of kinesiology are impoverished, but that they can be challenged and changed, as evidenced by departmental statements that, in their words, put kinesiology into historical and social context through, for instance, highlighting the significance of learning, but also unlearning the common sense that has been internalized and naturalized in a patriarchal, fat-phobic, ableist settler colonial society. Sullivan and Ali also consider mission and vision statements of kinesiology programs, expanding their analytic view to examine curricula, course offerings, and faculty complements as well. Like Smith and Jameson, these authors highlight epistemological fissures in the field of kinesiology, noting that despite intentions for an interdisciplinary approach in the kinesiology curriculum, there's been an emergence of two cultures that has led to an epistemological hierarchy, one which privileges scientific, positivist, and quantitative knowledge over sociological, critical, and interpretive inquiry. Such fissures and the privileging of scientific, positivist, and quantitative knowledge, they suggest, may implicitly reinforce colonial structures that subject students and faculty to forms of discrimination and oppression sustained by intersectional structures of oppression. They elaborate on the mechanisms by which such reinforcement unfolds, and I quote them at some length here. First, students from privileged social groups are not exposed to diverse knowledge and are thus unprepared to reflexively come to understand how they have benefited from dominant social structures. Second, those classmates from underprivileged groups are charged with learning course material that upholds oppressive regimes of knowledge that disproportionately harm them and their communities. And finally, students are not given an opportunity to learn different ways of knowing, nor are they exposed to important perspectives that have historically been subjugated or masked by those in power, including Indigenous, Black, and decolonial forms of knowledge. Ultimately, these programs reinforce the idea that humanities-based classes are complementary rather than necessary to the proper training of a kinesiology graduate. The methodological underpinnings of this project are constituted by my own paradigmatic assumptions and commitments. I start from the position, to borrow Anahid Al-Hardan's words, that research is far from an apolitical and ahistorical activity. It occurs within a set of historical, political, and social relations of power. In other words, colonial logics underpin most research activities in colonial institutions, and at least as importantly, in Al-Hardan's words, the power-knowledge nexus continues to be implicated in the contemporary coloniality of the world. In other words, if we understand the university as inextricably entangled with colonialism, imperialism, and racial capitalism, we must appreciate how our work perpetuates those very systems and actively work against doing so. I see this as part of a process of centering axiology at every stage of the research, interrogating, in Danielle Pier's words, quote, the often unexamined, unrecognized, or mistakenly universalized values that influence our work, personal or disciplinary assumptions about what is good and bad, right and wrong, and more or less valuable, worthy, desirable, and beautiful, end quote. In other work that Numa and I have submitted for review at a Scholarship of Teaching and Learning journal, we address institutional and professional pressures, as well as suggestions and supports that would be helpful for faculty members as they take on this work. While I'd be happy to address these issues, as well as specific questions around research method in the discussion following the talk, in what follows, I'll focus in on some narratives and analyses that relate specifically to kinesiology as an interdisciplinary field of study. All names presented, I will note, are pseudonyms. Various interviewees expressed concerns about doing a disservice to Indigenous communities. Some interviewees also noted the challenge of incorporating Indigenous content in more science-based courses. When reflecting on this uncertainty, they emphasized the need for concreteness to understand where Indigenous content could meaningfully fit and what the end result of indigenization might look like in such courses. Interviewees perceive this insecurity or uncertainty as a risk in the classroom. Leela, a scientist, put it like this: I don't want to do it half-assed, right? So I'm going to bring this content in and introduce it, and I want it to be I just don't want to do it half-assed. I want to do it properly. I want to make sure the research that I introduce and the studies and the scholars I introduce correspond to the content, complement it, but it's done correctly and in a way that I hopefully don't offend anyone, and I can, again, enrich the learning experience of my students. Elsewhere in the interview, Leela expressed a sentiment shared by several interviewees that in some respects she's not sure how to go about addressing this in her teaching practice. One of the barriers for me and outside of my wheelhouse class is I don't really know where to start or what type of resources to look for. I'm not sure exactly how to tie into current curriculum or current course content. So it's a little overwhelming when I think of it, a little daunting because I have just no direction of where to go. A second barrier, honestly, is probably more personal, is that I'm worried about doing a disservice to it or not integrating it properly. Here, Leela highlighted feeling somewhat daunted or overwhelmed at the prospect of doing this work, even as she expressed elsewhere in the interview the value of doing so. She also drew attention to her worry about doing a disservice to it, about not integrating it properly. Finally, I draw attention to the idea of tying Indigenous materials and perspectives into current curriculum or course content. This, too, came up repeatedly in interviews, with many faculty members conceptualizing this work as additive. In other words, the most common way of imagining this work, broadly speaking, goes along these lines. Teach what you're teaching already in the way you're already teaching it, but add or include Indigenous content. This is a point to which I return in a short while. Though they expressed it in different ways, each interviewee articulated a sense of responsibility and understanding that this is work they should be doing. Taylor reflected on his own journey, take your pick, as he came to understand his responsibilities in terms of what he calls inclusivity. To be honest, my first few years, it wasn't on my radar at all. I was just in survival mode. And then I think it was around the pandemic, just being exposed to very different ways of thinking, new ideas. There was the whole George Floyd incident, which was just talked about a lot. Then we started hearing notions at school of the importance of it, and just thinking about inclusivity, where I do basic levels of just trying to treat everyone as a human. And that's where that's been sort of a policy of mine, but starting to question if that's enough. Taylor expresses a deeply felt sense of responsibility to attend to the kinds of questions that were amplified following the murder of George Floyd at the hands of then Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin in the spring of 2020. Barb, meanwhile, tied her own sense of responsibility directly to the work of the TRC, saying, certainly hearing about the TRC, trying to figure out how does that fit. Initially being overwhelmed with the TRC. There's a lot of recommendations, and we've had some great workshops here that have been very stimulating. My work with the teaching center had me thinking, and also hearing sometimes some people's opposition. Oh, I can't do that in my class because I teach blah, 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 and thinking, but I wonder if you couldn't do, and then that would make it a little easier for me to think about my own classes and what I could or should be doing. Jeremy, a social science and management scholar, meanwhile, highlighted the question of bringing Indigenous voices into the classroom as he articulated a different perspective on the idea of responsibility. After describing some of the work he does in his courses to make specific connections to Indigenous peoples and communities, he candidly offered the following assessment of his own efforts to bring Indigenous voices into the classroom, saying, support in this area, kinesiology, and from an Indigenous voice is less apparent. I'll call myself guilty. I can't say it's difficult to find because I also haven't put in a significant amount of work to find it. I responded, which relates to your earlier point about bandwidth and capacity and workload and stuff. And Jeremy said, potentially, maybe just if I felt it was important enough, I probably would have done it. Jeremy makes a critical point here. This seems to me an insightful re-articulation of the adage, don't tell me what you believe or value, show me what you do, who you vote for, what you spend money on, and I will tell you what you value. As noted above, the work of weaving Indigenous knowledges and cultures into all we do is not simply a matter of adding Indigenous content. Rather, the work might be understood as more unsettling than that. At a fundamental level, it might involve loosening our grip on our courses as instructors, as Portia illustrated in her comments about the significance of consistently updating course content. Reflecting on this, Portia noted how she came to understand that the goal is not to throw the book at them and have some sort of trivia goal in mind, but that it was about understanding what history is, what sociology is, and what their place is within all of that. So yeah, it changes, but even the history, but especially the sociology, things always happen. So you always have to update, even sometimes on a weekly basis. The slides always change, or the course material always changes, depending on what's happening that week, that month, that season, what have you, right? So that constant vigilance for things that may impact whatever discussion is being had that week also means that nothing is set in stone. I linger here with Portia's point that nothing is set in stone. It seems to me that the idea of impermanence is a strong starting point for the unsettling work of taking seriously our responsibilities to engage with Indigenous perspectives and ways of knowing. The willingness to refuse the fixed nature of particular elements of one's teaching practice can be deeply generative, as Seth, a scientist, articulated. It's not that people try to do harm, it's that just by not knowing they do harm. I realized that by looking at my slides, especially for 2 courses in particular, there was no point in trying to save them. I started from scratch. I completely ditched the textbooks. So it just made me aware that if I'm not giving that information, whether it's perfectly relevant to the course content or not, people may do harm in the future within the position of healthcare, for example, just because of a lack of awareness, not out of malice. So that's become really important to me, but that also meant tearing down everything and starting basically from scratch. But that takes a lot of work, and to be honest, the resources just don't exist. Seth's first point in this excerpt seems to me a vital one. It's not that people try to do harm, it's just by not knowing they do harm. The other point Seth's narrative highlights is how much work is involved in unlearning. In his case, as he gained awareness of some of the troubling elements of his courses and course materials, he felt it important to tear down everything and start basically from scratch. Taylor too touches on the idea of harm, though he takes it in a slightly different direction, expressing that he worries about doing harm actually not having even a chance to repair it. Asked to elaborate, he offered, "If I could guarantee that my audience would call me on BS, I would jump in head first, but it's if they just take it as authority or assume that it's stagnant, and maybe it's just how I approach it." It's a good point, actually. If I go down this road, I probably would say this is a little bit uncomfortable for me. I might get things wrong. And if I do, I want you to tell me and challenge me. And that could probably help remedy at least 99% of that. Interestingly, after the interview, Taylor noted that had we had this conversation in his first few years as a faculty member, he wouldn't have expressed a willingness to quote unquote stick his neck out. With some experience and reflection, especially after the Floyd murder, as described earlier, though, he feels better equipped to do so. I think it just probably is going to end up being with most things, as taking a leap of faith and doing it authentically. Trying to deliver things in a way that is open to criticism from students, open to feedback from students. But yeah, trying to just jump into the pool and start swimming is probably where I'm at right now. And then do the same approach that I've done with other topics, where I deliver it, and then if it was wrong, I fix it. I think that's where I'm at. I just wish it came at less of a cost for getting it wrong. Where the other ones, if I interpreted the sport commitment model wrong, there's no negatives or very minimal negatives for me and for my students if I then come back and just correct it. That's the only piece that I find is more difficult about this, and maybe it's more of a fear thing. Importantly, Taylor named the fear, but seems willing to work with and through it to understand that the discomfort of this is part of the work itself. One striking commonality across many of the interviews is the idea that when faculty members start their post-secondary teaching careers, they do so from a foundation or base, perhaps more correctly, multiple foundations or bases. There are disciplinary and subdisciplinary foundations as reflected, for example, in instructors' own disciplinary training, as well as those enshrined in textbooks. There are also foundations from course materials passed along by supervisors or mentors. Beyond the question of the foundation from which one starts, instructors spend the early years of their career building a base in terms of their own teaching practice. Leela, for instance, noted this about her first few years. I got ahead of myself there, sorry. "My priority has been kind of establishing a base of lectures. a base of assignments, a base of rubrics, and then every summer, now that I'm no longer developing new courses, I have more time to go back to my base and kind of slowly tweak some lectures, tweak some exams, kind of revise. What all of this means, of course, is that foundations matter. Foundations matter in practical terms and at least as much in epistemological and axiological terms. The foundations from which one builds are not only about content, but also at a deeper level about what we know, what we should know, what we value as knowledge, and the very ways of knowing that are seen as legitimate, scientific, worthy of study, etc. It's important to flesh out this idea bearing in mind the points highlighted above about the historical roots and axiological underpinnings of kinesiology as a field of study. To borrow an idea that Janice Forsyth named on Friday in a conversation about a different specific project, one that Brian mentioned earlier, kinesiology has what she called inherited logics that are simply baked into kinesiology from generations previous. To the extent that ableism, colonialism, white supremacy, and cis-heteropatriarchy are baked into the project of kinesiology writ large, they are surely woven into the foundations most faculty members inherit as they embark on their scholarly careers. It's in this sense that I circle back to the work of Barnes and colleagues who highlight that unlearning is at least as important as learning, not only for students, but also, and maybe especially, for faculty. If faculty members in any subdisciplinary area take foundations simply as givens, as natural, or at least neutral, in Gaudry and Lorenz's terms, they are sure to reproduce the same logics that have been at the heart of the project of kinesiology since its inception. In this context, many people either do not have the knowledge or do not feel confident enough in their knowledge to build Indigenous materials and ways of knowing into their courses as they start their teaching careers. Later, when they might feel better prepared or more motivated to do this work, they might find inertia working against them because their base or foundation has also further entrenched the idea that these are indeed the foundational dimensions of particular courses or subdisciplines. Even for those who understand the importance of these issues, the question often becomes some version of how do I add Indigenous content into my courses, rather than reflection on how have colonial assumptions and worldviews already been built into the courses I'm teaching. Reflexivity is an active choice to step back and critically inquire into how course materials may reproduce settler colonial logics. The key here is to leverage uncertainty as a vital condition of engaging with this work, since the goal is not to produce a neatly packed end outcome or to solve a singular problem. Teaching is rarely this simple or linear. Rather, faculty members might embrace the discomfort that comes with stepping outside of hegemonic teaching practices, recognizing our role in perpetuating harm by simply going along with the institution's colonial underpinnings and logics. Seth, for example, hearkened back to a workshop that I facilitated with his department. At the time, I don't want to say not receptive to it, but I kind of had this thought process of, hey, it's just science. What am I supposed to do with this? Fact is fact. I'm just teaching the material. This isn't my job, I guess was my very honest description of how I was feeling at the time. Here, Seth taps into a couple of key ideas worth unpacking. First, his narrative about this moment during a workshop highlights the notion that fact is fact, which locates facts and science as somehow outside of systems of power, implicitly absolving science and scientists from complicity in or responsibilities for addressing social injustice in kinesiology and beyond. These, to harken back to Barnes, Nakamura, and Safai, are the, quote, tactics of depoliticization that extract academic programs, rationales, and impact from their historical emergence and social context, end quote. Following from that, this kind of narrative reproduces the two cultures problem of kinesiology that Sullivan and Ali highlight. The moment that Seth generously described in our conversation implies that the science courses in kinesiology will address the facts, so any work around power, colonialism, and racism, to harken back to the words of Barnes and colleagues, is only to be addressed, if at all, in sociocultural courses. Given Sullivan and Ali's point that kinesiology curricula and courses reproduce the idea that humanities-based classes are complementary rather than necessary to the proper training of a kinesiology graduate, the fact is fact logic towards which Seth points does important work. Seth is by no means the only interviewee who touched on this two cultures idea. I highlight his story in particular because he has since reflected deeply and come to understand his professional responsibilities in much more expansive terms. In our conversation, he said, as we kept doing workshop sessions and as we would have some other workshops that the university was setting up, Between those different experiences, I started looking at my own research, started looking at all aspects of my own teaching and saying, okay, yeah, if you look at this historically, I'm looking at this as a very white European way of doing this. So this led me to a lot of changes. Seth's narrative here is deeply important. He describes the process by which he came to understand the situatedness of his teaching and research activities, a process that, as described earlier, led him to ditch his textbooks and start from scratch. I highlight this not to suggest that there is a correct way of doing this work, but to point to what is possible if and when faculty members do the labor of understanding their own situatedness and the situatedness of their areas of expertise, and to consider how they might take up their responsibilities differently in the classroom and beyond. Interviews made clear that many faculty members feel unprepared to do much in the classroom until and unless they are more certain or confident. This, of course, means that they don't have the opportunity to try it in the classroom, to learn from that experience, to reflect on it, and so on. So there's a kind of security in doing what they know, what we know. I am very much implicated here. A security that leaves colonial practices, structures, and curricula firmly entrenched. This brings me to the work of Lisa Slater, who highlights that ignorance, quote, isn't simply not knowing, but is a form of knowing supported by the socio-political system. In that sense, to return to the uncertainty expressed in a number of interviews, I emphasize, borrowing again from Slater, that uncertainty is not something that can simply be cataloged by the intellect. It needs to be experienced, deeply felt. It stays with you. In doing so, it has the potential to disturb the emotional politics of settler colonialism. It also implicates one in the here and now, in the messy, ordinary, contaminated world. The messy, ordinary, contaminated world of the university, and of kinesiology specifically, is the focus of my comments today. What I heard in several interviews was some version of, I don't know enough, I'm not sure how to do this work, and I'm worried about what might happen in the classroom if I don't do it correctly. Yet the idea of knowing itself, as commonly conceptualized in academia, is nested within a settler logic wherein agents assert themselves as the rightful holders, and I would add withholders, of knowledge. It is crucial to contextualize what Grande calls the demand to know as part and parcel of the settler colonial project. This imperative for certainty reproduces settler colonial authority and settler belonging. In the context of the classroom, to borrow again from Slater, what is rendered invisible, a sleight of hand, is that white settlers cannot be made to feel uncertain. In this scenario, settlers imagine uncertainty as signaling a threat rather than fundamental to forming, or more so reforming, political relationships, a feeling that alerts one to other possibilities. As Seth's narrative, for instance, illuminates, it is possible for settlers to refuse this demand to know, to embrace uncertainty, and consequently to reform political relationships. Seth and others who have done this kind of work, including some folks in this room, are living testament to these other possibilities. Rather than striving for an approach to indigenization in which faculty members know in advance how things will unfold, they, or again, more correctly, we, can reframe this work as a constant process of learning, unlearning, and reevaluating different ideas and perspectives. All of this, I suggest, might be part of faculty members, and particularly settler scholars' understandings of ourselves, not as rightful inheritors of land, of knowledge, but as learners working to be good visitors and guests, as theorized by Métis scholar Dylan Miner. To be clear and explicit about it, my suggestion is not that this is work for scholars in the biophysical sciences subdisciplines, but for all of us. Though I'm in a sociology department, I am very much connected to a kinesiology department at the U of L. To the extent that we simplistically conceptualize biophysical sciences as the depoliticized spaces and sociocultural courses as those that consistently take up questions of power and inequality, we reproduce the two cultures problem that Sullivan and Ali highlight. We feed into a model that disproportionately divides the work ahead, and not least, we assume that sociocultural scholars are all doing meaningful work in these directions, which I am here to tell you is not what I see in the world. The work ahead, in other words, is both more unsettling and more collective than such a conceptualization would allow. In my comments today, my goal has been to put the narratives of faculty members in conversation with the context in which their work takes place, highlighting both the colonial logics that structure our work and possibilities for resisting and perhaps refusing some of those logics in our messy, ordinary, contaminated classrooms. Needless to say, perhaps, but this will take work. It will take work on the part of individual faculty members. It will take work to learn about Indigenous peoples, histories, cultures, and ways of knowing, and about settler colonialism. It will also take work to unlearn some of what we have simply absorbed in what Mark Rifkin calls settler common sense through our own lived experience, including and especially in the context of academia. All of this will be necessary if we are to take up the challenge issued by Sullivan and Ali. Kinesiology programs need to challenge their role in reproducing oppression and discrimination. If curriculum and operating practices continue to privilege Western, Eurocentric, and neoliberal structures, they risk failing to provide more privileged students with diverse perspectives within the kinesiology field. As many kinesiology students aspire to careers in health, research, and education, anti-oppressive knowledge and training is integral to helping future graduates provide optimal care for folks from diverse communities and backgrounds. Thank you. I'd be delighted to chat further in the few minutes that we have remaining or in other spaces and times.
Questions, but I just will remind you, if in the audience, if you do have a question, if you could press the button on the microphone in front of you and ask your question into the microphone.
I was ready to run microphones out there and do like a, oh, there's an old game show. Let's Make a Deal. Was that the one? I'm going back a long way, people. Somebody's got quiet. Please. Yeah, thank you.
So I just have, thank you very much for your really wonderful talk. I actually was just interested in the interviews you conducted. Like, I was wondering, did you have a lot of people that said, no, I don't even want to do the interview? And the people, because you raised like maybe 3 voices, potentially 3 or 4. Like, were there a lot more? And
there were about 12 before this morning at 4 o'clock. When I realized that the talk was about 20 minutes too long. But so let me say a little bit more about that. I'm happy to. So far we've done 13 interviews. I say we because, as I say, Newman and I have been doing a lot of this work together. And thus far, those interviews have all been in 3 departments where I've facilitated workshops, that I might call Unsettling Our Teaching Practices. And we started there with a couple of things in mind. One, I knew I could assume, sorry, I'm going to vacillate between I and we because it sort of depends when Numa comes into the picture. I knew I could assume a certain level of familiarity with the conversation with folks who had had these workshops. Even if they didn't attend the workshop, I knew they were part of a department that was willing to devote resources to such a workshop. So I knew that was the starting point. And then the second thing, and this maybe goes more directly to your question, is there was a lot of I devoted a lot of energy and attention in those workshops to fostering a space of trust, like for us to be vulnerable together and go like, I don't know how to do this. Like, what do I, where do I even go? And so I reasoned that might, that trust just might serve me well in the context of the interviews. And so I found that people have been pretty receptive to it so far. I mean, I certainly got some non-responses, some silence. I got one person who was like, I want no part of what you're doing. So there's definitely a degree of self-selection at work here. And those 13 folks that I have sat down with, it's actually really interesting, and we can talk more about this later maybe, but it's really interesting to reflect on, the openness with which they come to that. So one of the things that would happen, actually the very first interview was a good example of this. We sat down and did an interview, and at the end of any qualitative interview, I'll say something like, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you want to come back to? And this person was like, tell me if I'm doing this right. Like, that's what they really wanted to talk about. And I was like, you're not going to like my answer, because my answer is there is no right. There was more to the answer. Anyway, all of that is to say that by and large, folks have been pretty receptive to it. But precisely because I think there's been a kind of a self-selection at work. So the narratives that you're getting, I think by and large, are the folks who have bought into the importance of it. And then for some of them at least are like, I get that it's important. Now what? Yeah, thank you. Please.
Hi, I'm Jasmine Mon. I apologize for being late. I was teaching. So if you addressed this already, you can just forego my question. I really appreciate your acknowledgement that making change is hard, and the idea of not knowing if you're doing it right is uncomfortable. So how do we help faculty to be comfortable with being uncomfortable?
It's such a great question. And so in the earlier work that Numa and I have aimed at a scholarship of teaching and learning journal. We're talking more generally about that and some of the supports. Some of the things that I was hearing most frequently, people want to have somebody that they can go to, right? Moss and I were having this conversation the other day. There's a certain amount of like permission seeking maybe. And so in a context where people are like, I don't want to do this badly, I don't want to do it half-assed, like however they might frame that, they want somebody that they can go to and say, here's something that I'm thinking of doing, tell me I'm not about to step on a landmine that I don't even know about. So that's one piece. I think another piece is there's a disconnect at lots of institutions, and I don't know how true that would be here. Faculty members would literally say like, okay, wait a minute. I go to every meeting and I see a land acknowledgement that is not meaningful and not picked up in any meaningful way, but I'm supposed to be doing this in the classroom? What are y'all talking about? Right, so I think there are a number of things at work there, my sense is that folks want A, resources, and B, connection. And so one of the interesting things that's come out of this work for me personally to reflect on that I didn't anticipate when I started doing these interviews was, I would talk to somebody who was, in whatever specialization, let's say it's biomechanics, who was like, I have no idea where to start. And I'm like, oh, actually, I know a biomechanist who's doing this. Can I hook you up? And then, with the consent of both parties, and I have no idea what they then did, but they, just having those connections, I think, makes it much more thinkable for folks. I mean, it was and remains deeply uncomfortable for me, some of the work that I'm trying to do, because you just like peel back a layer and there's another layer, and then you peel back that layer and, all of the things. And so I think one of the things that I find about academia generally is that we so often do these things in isolation, right? Whatever our thing is. And there's so much value that we can get from getting together with other folks who are either a little bit ahead of us on that path or who are at the same point, but at least we can commiserate and go, you're stuck? Me too. Like, I don't know. I don't know if how well that answers your question, but that's really what I was hearing from folks. Yeah, thank you. I mean, a side note maybe that's related, like one of the things, this long predates this project, but I found it useful. One of the things that I started curating was like, I've just called it a pop culture diet. Because I find in the classroom as well, when we're talking, I teach a course on sport, recreation, and settler colonialism, and students will sometimes be like, where can I start? Apart from the stuff that we're reading for this course, like I'm super interested, so I now have a file. I'm like, you want a podcast? I've got 15 podcasts for you. You want music? I've got that. You want fiction? I've got that. And some folks, connected to this project have found that useful as well, helpful because they just, like me, not that long ago, didn't even know where to look. Yeah, which is also settler colonialism at work, right? Was there a hand over here? Brian.
Thanks so much. About here. I'm wondering, so clearly in some of your early work, and I know you refer to others who study curricula, what's offered, what's not. I'm wondering if, I have my own thoughts on this, but when you look at a curriculum for like a kinesiology program and you're thinking about that as a document that itself offers a message to us before you even take any courses, I'm wondering if you might have some thoughts on what you look for when you read a handbook or something like that before you even begin to think about what's actually offered in courses, like what you see, what you like to see, what you're concerned about, those sorts of things.
It's a great question. I really think like Sullivan and Ali's articulation really resonates for me. Like, where does sociocultural stuff fit? Like, how is that codified? And for me, that shows up in a number of places. Like, where in the curriculum is it? Do all students, so at the U of L, for example, you can do a BSc in kinesiology or a BA in kinesiology. And if you're on the BSc side, you barely have to touch any of the sociocultural courses. Only if you're, so again, there's a kind of a siloing or something like that. Do students only encounter it at the senior level, by which point it can't help but be a certain kind of additive or window dressing or something? Again, not in terms of how it's taught, but in terms of like how it's conceptualized at the curriculum level. The other place that I want to go with it is to think about, in the courses that don't necessarily read as sociocultural, and I kind of accidentally ended up connected to one of these because there's a prof at U of L, now retired, who was working on this book called Fit and Well, that I don't know if anyone here teaches it. Sorry, I keep touching the mic. and this person's editors or the publishers gave them a mandate, like we would actually like to see more of this in the text. And so this, because we knew each other, this person reached out to me, and to make a long story short, a Cree grad student and I did some work helping with the text in that way. And so now in a course that is ostensibly only about fitness and wellness, and the textbook was very like biophysical and, did all kinds of things in that sort of depoliticized way that Barnes and et al. Talk about. Now they're learning about like grassy narrows. They're learning about food insecurity. They're learning about all kinds of things that are tied in with those topics, related to fitness and wellness. But it's just going to be woven into a class that is like a first year, is almost a gateway course in the discipline. And again, I'm not saying like that's the right thing or the work is complete or anything else. But I do think, I give full credit to that instructor, because my first response when they reached out was to say, that depends. Like, are you looking to tick a box here, or are you ready to be challenged on some stuff? And they were like, no, do it. Like, make me work. And so that for me that's where I see, Moss and I were talking about hope the other day. That's where I see hope is, somebody like Seth, who's like, who in, I don't know, 6 months or a year and a half or something goes from fact is fact to like, I'm throwing it all out. And I mean, there are all kinds of things that I haven't touched on here today about labor and who's well positioned to do that labor, and like how this falls disproportionately and all these kinds of things. And I don't mean to gloss those over, but you've raised so many thought bubbles for me. So thank you. Oh, is there? Yeah. How do I do this? Janice, are you able to unmute yourself? And yeah, please.
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
Oh, awesome. Anyway, sorry I couldn't be there today. Still working on that Shirk deadline. Anyway, it was an outstanding presentation. And I think maybe this is a good time to ask the question, because it ties into what you were just talking about in terms of labor and who gets to do this work. And so I was just wondering, like, have you given any thought to, or what are your thoughts about like doing this work without exhausting Indigenous students, staff, and faculty, right? Because there's just so few of us who are in kinesiology programs. Me being just re-entering, back into the space here at UBC. And it carries like a lot of additional weight, and every institution is different. Some, the work is just, can be really, really toxic. Other, it's just like a lot of labor. So how do you, what are your thoughts around doing this work without exhausting those people?
Yeah, no, thank you. It's such an important question. And that, I want to go in a couple of different directions with this, because I think there are tensions pulling in multiple directions here. One, I think it's super important for white settlers, I'm really talking about me here, but lots of white settlers, right, to stay in our lane, right? And I'm not, at no point, I mean, this is a conversation that we've had, of course, and now I'm talking down to the screen here. At no point, do I want to speak for Indigenous peoples, or take up space. And pulling in exactly the opposite direction, I think there's a lot of work that actually should be done by settlers. There was somebody, a scholar by the name of Kim Williams, who came in and did a guest talk in a course that I'm teaching this semester just last week, and sort of said, like, this is my problem, like, I'm complicit in this, so it's actually my job to help fix it. So that's like the fine line that I'm trying to walk, I suppose, is to hold space for, this actually, it really matters that an Indigenous person is involved in this kind of work. And this other work, that's where settlers actually should be doing some of the heavy lifting, again, while staying in our lane. Because, much better than I do, this work falls radically disproportionately to Indigenous and racialized scholars. And so it's really important to figure out ways and access points where that's not, and again, I've been guilty of this myself, where I'm like, I'm teaching this thing, I'm going to get an Indigenous person to come in and talk about this. There's another way to imagine that. Not because there's never a moment to invite the Indigenous scholar in, or the Indigenous, elder or whatever, but because there are times when it's actually like, no, that's your job to figure that out. and my job or the institution's job or whoever's to figure out like how do we support that person to do that. But it can't all fall to the very, very small number of folks who are already being pulled in many too many directions.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think the point about like, you know, having dialogues around that, like ongoing dialogues, is so important because, again, who you have in those spaces just varies too from institution to institution. Like I've been around the space so long now, you know, if it were someone new entering into this space and having this conversation with them, I'm sure it would look very different. And we all come from kind of our own different backgrounds, you know, in terms of what Indigenous people and what we bring to the table. And yeah, and so it's, you know, that too is really, really tricky, you know, as you were talking about, because it requires conversations about how those relationships get formed and who is going to carry what work and, you know, their comfort level in moving certain parts forward. So thanks. Yeah, that was really good. Thanks.
Thank you. I can feel moss lurking. I think we might be about time to leave the room.
Yes, it is time. Sorry, but what a fantastic presentation, and the conversation afterwards was excellent, and maybe we can keep it going, but we do need to call an end to this. And with that, I'd like to thank you, Jay, with some offerings, and please join me in welcoming or thanking Jay for this.